The photograph sat in its dusty glass frame, quiet and unassuming, until Edna Greel turned it over and caught her breath. She'd been tasked with cataloging the Bellamy Folklore Institute's archival backlog, mostly mundane farm portraits, daguerreotypes of stoic families, and holiday shots from long-abandoned parishes. This one, labeled only Ruck Farm, 1887, seemed no different at first. Two boys, seated on a wooden bench, stared solemnly into the camera. Their woolen coats were buttoned to the throat, their Sunday boots polished clean. The harvest sun bathed their faces in a soft clarity that seemed almost too perfect. The background was a field of brown grass, a clapboard farmhouse just beyond the frame's edge, a few chickens blurred in motion near the bottom left. But then she saw them. A third set of legs. They were not boyish or clothed. They were bare, pale, and adult-sized, and crouched awkwardly beneath the bench, vanishing mid-calf into the darkened earth as if swallowed by it. Edna blinked, leaned closer. The skin texture was visible. The toes curled slightly inward, the right foot turned in at a strange angle. She flipped the frame over, checking the backing. Original. No tampering, no insert. She checked the registry. October 9th, 1887. And that's when her breath caught in her chest. By the time the photo was brought to the Vermont Society of Photographic Study, the panel of experts had already reviewed a magnified plate. One of them, a sharp-eyed technician named Merrill Doss, had run the negative under polarized light and concluded, no scratches, no overlay, no sign of double exposure. He'd stared at the ghostly feet for a long time before murmuring, "It's original." And it shouldn't be. The photograph had been taken by Aldous Keene, a traveling portraitist known for his sharp compositions and silent demeanor. His notes from that season listed the photo as Plate 34. Fine sun. Full faces. Mid-harvest. Nothing unusual. But in the image, the shadows told another story. Harold Ruck sat on the left. He was 10, tall for his age, with a serious jaw and hands folded neatly in his lap. His younger brother, Benjamin, just 6, leaned slightly toward him, his fingers curled tightly around the edge of the bench. Both boys looked directly into the lens with the stiff discomfort of children told to sit still by an unfamiliar adult. Behind them was the gentle dip of the Dunsmuir field, the golden crops catching the dying light of afternoon, and beneath the bench, those legs, unmoving, unclaimed. It wasn't until 1921 that the image was re-examined in detail. Edna Greel, then just a junior archivist, had taken it to a local exhibition planning committee. She wasn't even supposed to study it that long, but the feet bothered her. "It's not dirt," she told her supervisor, tapping the plate gently. "You can see the veins." The boys' statements from years later, found in unrelated parish interviews, deepened the mystery. When shown the cropped image, Harold, then in his 40s, paused. His hands trembled slightly as he said, "Mama said never to speak of the man who crouched." Benjamin had refused to even enter the room. "Mama made us promise," he said. "If we sat still, he wouldn't come close." The Institute requested further analysis. A chemical lab in Montpellier examined the plate and found no signs of chemical tampering, no signs of layered exposure. The photo was, in every measurable way, genuine. But the problem wasn't what they could measure. It was what they couldn't. The legs ended mid-calf, not due to blur or fade, but because the lower limbs simply dissolved into the dirt. No shoe prints, no displacement of soil, no indent where weight should have sunk the feet. Just legs, suspended, kneeling, impossibly real. Worse still, the angle suggested that whoever or whatever those legs belonged to had been crouching close enough for the boys to feel their presence. And yet, neither flinched in the photo. Neither looked afraid. It was as if they had learned, perhaps long before, to stay perfectly still and never look down. By the time Bellamy Folklore Institute acquired the image in 1933, rumors had already begun to circulate. Some said Aldous Keene tried to burn the original after noticing something strange when developing the print. Others whispered that the boys had once claimed to see a man with no voice and no face, who came only when they were alone. No source could confirm these rumors, but one detail held firm in every version. The photograph was never meant to be more than a keepsake, but it had become a record of something else, something neither boy had ever spoken of again. In 1946, a visitor at the Institute claimed to see movement in the photo, a twitch in the toes beneath the bench. That same visitor collapsed in the gallery, his heart racing, muttering something about the sound of breathing. The room was shuttered for 2 years. Still the legs remained. They did not fade with time. They did not vanish as negatives decayed or glass plates clouded. They stayed exactly as they had been, naked, crouched, vanishing into nothing. And, worst of all, as one researcher later noted, the shadow under the bench does not match the lighting in the rest of the photograph. The Ruck brothers, when reached in later years, refused to give interviews. Harold lived in a small farmhouse outside of Norburn until his death in 1963. Benjamin, estranged and reportedly reclusive, died alone in a sanitarium. Neither left descendants. The photograph remains sealed in the archive vault marked 3B. It is not reproduced in books. It is not shown in exhibitions. And the image, when digitized for a brief moment in 1996, caused a system-wide crash that corrupted over 40% of the Institute's photo archive. Now, the photo rests in a lightless, humidity-sealed drawer in the Bellamy Folklore Institute, watched over but never touched, and on its label, written in trembling pen, "What you're about to hear is the case that made them seal Room 3B permanently." The photograph was taken just after noon. The shadows were short, the autumn wind was gentle, and the leaves around the Ruck farmhouse had begun their slow, golden fall. Harold Ruck, age 10, adjusted his collar stiffly as he sat on the bench, squinting slightly into the sun. Beside him, Benjamin, just 6, swung his small feet in nervous rhythm. The photographer, Aldous Keene, gave brief instructions from behind the tailboard-mounted Kodak number. One, his voice muffled by the black cloth draped over his head. "Keep still, boys." "One click, then we're done," Keene said, adjusting the brass fittings with practiced hands. The air held the sharp, earthy scent of soil and drying hay. A distant crow cawed once, sharp and abrupt, before silence returned. The shutter snapped. Neither child smiled. A week later, the photograph was delivered to the Ruck family in a wax-sealed envelope, one of several plates taken that day. Mr. Ruck filed it away with little fanfare, just another image for the family ledger. But nearly 100 miles away, Keene made a note in his leather-bound journal. Plate 34. Fine sun, full faces, mid-harvest. The entry was neat, consistent, and without remark. It should have ended there. But in the parish of Dunsmuir, Reverend Cyril Marin wrote a curious line in the village register that same week, a brief note lodged between a recorded baptism and a marriage license. A presence felt near the Ruck property. Keep children close. No name was attached, no warning bells rang. But in such a small town, where every visitor's arrival was whispered before their first footstep crossed the tavern threshold, it was unusual, and the strangeness did not go unnoticed. At the inn that night, old Josiah Brandt, who kept the guest ledger for 42 years, thumbed through the register twice before closing it slowly. "No one stayed that day," he murmured, "and no one passed through." Down the road, the laborers finishing the final harvest for the Fenley orchard came home short-handed by one man. But no tools were missing, and no coat was left behind. They'd dismissed it as a mistake in counting. It wasn't. 3 days later, Reverend Marin visited the Ruck farmhouse under the polite guise of a social call. He sipped warm cider in the kitchen while Mrs. Ruck tended to the stove and Mr. Ruck sorted seed accounts in the parlor. Harold sat near the hearth, carving a thin stick with his pocket-knife, while Benjamin hummed a tune only he seemed to know. "How was the photography?" Marin asked casually, his tone light but eyes alert. Harold paused in his carving. "It was fine." The man said I shouldn't blink. I didn't. Benjamin looked up. "He crouched funny when he took the picture," he said, then frowned. "Not the man with the camera. The other one. The barefoot one under the bench." The room stilled. Mrs. Ruck turned from the stove. "What did you say, Benjamin?" The boy's frown deepened. "I don't remember." Marin's fingers tightened around his mug. Later that evening, as he left the farmhouse and stepped into the cooling dusk, Marin paused at the edge of the ruck yard and looked back toward the bench. A shadow clung to the base of it, too long for the hour, too still. The next morning, he wrote again in the parish register, a second line beneath the first. No birth, no death, no guest. But something seen. He locked the book afterward and did not speak of it again for 20 years. Back in his traveling cart, Aldous Keene prepared to move on to his next township. He had already packed the plates, secured the tripod, and cleaned the lenses. But something made him hesitate. He turned the page of his journal and stared again at plate 34. The more he looked, the more he felt that he had missed something, not in the photograph, but in the air that day. A quiet wrongness, like a second breath in a room with only one person. He thought about sending the cropped version to the Ruck family, but the enlarger bulb had cracked twice, and the chemicals had turned dark in the bottle. That night, he wrapped plate 34 in cloth and set it aside from the others. That same week, across the hamlet, a hunter named Ellis Frayne claimed he heard barefoot steps trailing him in the woods, though he never saw a soul. "It weren't deer," he told the blacksmith. "It were too soft and too close." The ground, where he knelt to reload, had an imprint beside his own. A bare foot, adult-sized, sunk half an inch into the frost. By the end of October, the leaves had fallen. The bench outside the Ruck farmhouse sat empty. The photograph was tucked into a family Bible, stored on the highest shelf. Neither boy mentioned the crouching man again, but the image, years later, would whisper to anyone who dared to look too long. The image should have belonged to memory, but something else claimed it. The enlarging lantern shattered its second bulb at exactly 11:13 p.m. Aldous Keene jerked back in surprise, the hiss of the filament followed by the sharp pop and thin ribbon of smoke curling upward from the ruined glass. He stared at the fractured bulb, its metal base still glowing faintly as the workshop dimmed around him. For a long moment, he said nothing. The only sound was the quiet tick of his wall clock and the faint creak of the snow-heavy eaves outside. He set the failed print down gently on his oak desk and opened his ledger with a slow, deliberate hand. In the margin, next to the entry marked Plate 34, he wrote, "Third form reappears in successive exposures." Not artifact, the cropped enlargements had not removed the anomaly. In fact, with each attempt to isolate just the boys, the shape beneath the bench seemed to grow clearer, more defined, more human. Bare feet, calf muscle. A bent knee angled just beyond what should be in frame. And always, always, the suggestion of weight, of presence. Aldous exhaled slowly, wiping his spectacles with a cloth as he stared at the latest failed print. It was as if something was pushing against the boundary of the photograph, demanding to be seen. The shadows no longer behaved like shadows. They held volume, direction, heat. He stood up and crossed the small room to the back shelf, where his previous glass plates were carefully stored. Pulling out plate 34, he held it up against the gas lamp, tilting it ever so slightly. The two boys stared back, frozen in mid-smile, their hands folded politely on their laps. But beneath them, yes, there, those legs again. Just the legs. No torso, no face, not even a suggestion of clothing. "Enough," he muttered to himself. By morning, Aldous made the decision to contact the Ruck family. They deserved to know, he reasoned. even if it was nothing, just a flaw, a trick of chemistry or light, they had paid him for the image. But when he sat down to write the letter, his hand shook. Not from fear, not at first, but from doubt. What could he possibly say? Dear Rux, I believe a third party appeared in your family photograph. May I send you a print? He never sent the letter. Instead, 3 days later, he packed his satchel and made the trip through sleet and wind back to Dunsmuir Hollow. The farmhouse stood quiet under a gray sky. Aldous knocked twice on the weather-worn door and was met by a cautious eye through the curtain. It was Harold who answered. The boy had grown taller since the photograph. Still just 10, but his shoulders had squared slightly, and his voice carried the clipped tone of someone who'd been made to mature quickly. He stepped aside without a word. Inside, the parlor was warm from the stove, but no cheer lingered in the room. Aldous sat on the edge of a chair and removed the wrapped print from his bag. He hesitated. This isn't the full plate, he said. I cropped it in for clarity. But I think you need to see this. He handed the image over. Harold took it with both hands. His eyes narrowed as he studied the photo. Then, all at once, the color drained from his cheeks. The boy's fingers tightened on the edges of the paper. Mama said, he began, voice trembling. Mama said never to speak of the man who crouched. The silence that followed was thick and immediate. Aldous leaned forward, confused and suddenly chilled. What man, Harold? But the boy only shook his head and set the print face down on the table. He stood up without another word and walked to the stairs. From the hallway beyond, a soft sob echoed. Benjamin. The younger Ruck boy refused to come downstairs, refused to speak. When Aldous left, he caught a glimpse of the child curled in the hallway, staring at the family's bench with wide, wet eyes. It would later be noted that Benjamin never sat on another bench for the rest of his life. Spring came quickly that year, but it brought no clarity. Disturbed and quietly unnerved by the incident, Aldous could no longer bear to store the original plate in his studio. He wrapped it carefully in cotton, placed it in a cedar box, and sold it for a pittance to a local collector named Ransom Twide. A quiet man, a clerk, known to most only by his solitary routines and habit of walking with an oil lantern even in daylight. Twide never married. He kept the box beneath his bed, nestled among thick quilts and lined drawers. In his final years, neighbors noted strange complaints, stories of footsteps in the night, the sound of damp skin slapping against old wood, the sudden pull of gravity in empty rooms. Twide rarely spoke of such things, but once, while seated near the town's market well, he was overheard whispering to no one in particular. I never hear them walk in, only when they crouch, only when they wait. Those were among his last spoken words. He passed in his sleep, peacefully according to the coroner. But when his belongings were sorted by a cousin from out of town, the cedar box remained untouched, locked, and cold to the touch despite the midsummer heat. One item was found beside his bed, a folded scrap of paper, written in Aldous Keene's slanted hand, with one line underlined twice. Third form reappears in successive exposures, not artifact, and beneath it, scrawled in Twide's own ink, until his death, he claimed he sometimes heard a barefoot tread on floorboards that were never walked on. The entry was dry, clinical, and nearly forgotten, buried among 100 fading records inside a cabinet at the Northfield Historical Museum. Entry 892. G. Ruck family, 1887. Image with curious appendage. But on a rainy afternoon in late September 1903, a young museum assistant named Eli Morin pulled it from the drawer while indexing artifacts for an upcoming fall exhibit. He had no reason to believe it was anything more than a typical family portrait from the post-war period until he placed the fragile glass plate under the viewing glass and nearly dropped it. There, in clear exposure, were 2 young boys seated on a rough wooden bench. Their faces were solemn, the sunlight across their coats warm and even. But beneath the bench, Eli blinked twice, There was a third set of legs. Adult legs. Bare. Faintly dirty, as though pressed into soil. They ended just below the calf, vanishing where the shadows deepened. Eli's fingers trembled slightly as he leaned closer, then recoiled. "There's no upper body," he whispered to himself, breath fogging the glass. "How can there be no upper body?" The curator dismissed it at first. Optical illusion. Happens with older plates, but a note was filed regardless, and the entry remained untouched until 1913, when a short article in the Optic Gazette reawakened interest. Titled "The Legs Without a Man," the article featured a cropped reprint of the image and invited readers to explain the unclaimed limbs that appear beneath the Ruck boys of Dunsmuir Hollow. Several letters were sent in, citing folklore, camera tricks, or even spirit photography. Most were ignored, but one letter caught the eye of Professor Alric Dent, a mechanical imaging specialist from Marston College of Engineering. Reserved, methodical, and known for his obsession with early exposure irregularities, Dent requested the original plate for analysis. His first session was quiet. By the second, he was asking for the institution's early prism loop. By the third, he had shipped in his own prototype photodensitometer, a boxy, brass-bound device capable of measuring light density to minute degrees. For days, he worked in isolation, the dim lab lit only by gas lamps and filtered sunlight. On the sixth day, his assistant, Nathan Hurl, arrived to find Dent seated rigidly at the bench, his hand clutching a note he had just written. "Motion," the note read, "captured movement in still time, distortion inconsistent with the boy's limb length, unexplained thermal shift." Something moved. When asked what it meant, Dent did not answer directly. He only said, "The exposure has recorded something that should not move. That should not be seen." He returned the plate 2 days later, declining payment. When pressed by the museum board to elaborate, he grew visibly agitated, fingers tapping his chair arm with increasing speed. "There's heat," he said finally, "in the shape. In the air around the legs. Like a figure entering or leaving." That winter, Dent resigned from Marston College without explanation. The story might have faded again into obscurity if not for an unsettling claim made in 1922 by nurse Lyda Craik of Glastrow Asylum. She had been working the night shift in the West Wing when a young patient named Mina Ruck, age 31, committed 6 years prior for persistent muttering and delusional fixation, began drawing with unusual focus. Craik, curious and accustomed to the incoherent scribbles of most patients, approached Mina's bedside. The image startled her. Drawn in charcoal was the exact scene from the Ruck Plate, the bench, the 2 boys, and beneath it, a third set of legs. Craik had never seen the photograph herself, but later described the drawing to a visiting archivist. "The toes were too detailed," she said. "You could see the bend in the knee. It was like someone had knelt down and never left." When asked how Mina could have known the image, Craik shrugged. She said she'd seen it as a child. That the boys were family. That there were 3 on the bench, always 3. The timeline, however, made that impossible. Mina Ruck was born in 1891, 4 years after the photograph was taken. She had never lived in Dunsmuir. She had no known connection to Harold or Benjamin. And yet, when researchers showed her a copy of the actual plate weeks later, she merely nodded and said, "He was always crouching." Mama said not to look if he was. That same night, she began to scream in her sleep, over and over, "Don't let him crawl out the dark." She refused meals for 2 weeks and never drew again. The asylum filed a full report, but it was buried behind routine casework. Mina's final years were spent in near silence, save for one phrase that staff claimed she whispered in passing to a groundskeeper. There were 3 on the bench. Always 3. And yet, Mina was born in 1891. She should not have remembered the photo. She should not have remembered anything at all. The man in the photograph had no name. But by 1954, 3 men believed they could explain his legs. It was at a closed-door session of the Vermont Society of Photographic Study, held that October in a crumbling lecture hall at Halberton College, where Dr. Cale Whitgrove, pale, meticulous, and slightly stooped from long hours at microscopes, unrolled the reproduction of Plate 34 across the varnished table. A hush fell over the room. The image was still as haunting as ever. 2 brothers on a bench, their hands folded politely, their boots polished and scuffed in just the right balance. But beneath the bench, still there, still wrong, were the bare legs. "I believe," Whitgrove began, pointing with a trembling finger, "that this is an optical artifact, a misalignment of exposure, a merged image from the shadow of a tripod leg and a muddy depression in the dirt." He adjusted his wireframe glasses with a careful hand. "Notice here, the faint curvature, what we perceive as a knee, could easily be the raised mound of earth catching more light than expected." He spoke calmly, methodically, as if dissecting a cadaver in front of young students. But, one by one, the others began shaking their heads. "There are 5 toes," said Alden Kemp, a junior researcher seated near the door, "and the bend is anatomical, not topographical." Whitgrove's brow tightened. Light plays tricks. The early Kodaks were far from precise, but the room was not convinced. The legs in the photograph bore too much intention, too much symmetry, to be dismissed by shadow alone. Later that winter, another theory emerged, one not born of light, but deception. Professor Ezra Lantham, a man with a background in 19th-century photographic history, gave a lecture in Brattleboro titled Staged Specters: Trickery in the Age of Glass Plates. He presented a bold suggestion. Aldous Keene had faked the photograph. He needed attention, Lantham insisted to the gathered attendees. He was competing with younger photographers and his bookings were waning. Lantham produced letters, questionable in origin, claiming Keene once considered adding peculiarities to his work to increase intrigue. "What better trick," he said, pacing across the dais, "than a phantom set of legs? It would spark whispers, superstition, and perhaps bring his name to the fore." But when pressed by journalists afterward, Lantham faltered. "If it was a hoax," asked one reporter, "why didn't Keene exhibit the image? Why sell it quietly to a private collector and never speak of it again?" Lantham had no answer. In truth, the theory collapsed on its own weight. Keene's surviving plates, more than 24 of them, were clean. No anomalies, no spectral gimmicks. And the Ruck photo, so chilling and unforgettable, had never been published, never made a penny. Why craft a ghost and then bury it? And so it was the third theory, quietly whispered at first, that took hold. It came from Dr. Thelda Quarry, a folklorist with unruly gray hair and a habit of speaking in riddles. She had never attended the Photographic Society's meetings. Instead, she taught at a small, moss-covered institute tucked away in the northern woods. But her paper, Temporal Folds in Communal Memory, a study of spectral anchoring in still imagery, began to circulate among scholars like a whispered rumor. In it, Quarry described what she called a photo lure, a moment in time so emotionally charged, or so strangely composed, that it acted like a magnet across dimensions. Her claim, certain photographs did not just record the past, but invited it in, invited something in. She cited 3 other examples, all from the same region. One, a school photo from 1885 in which a 6th hand rests gently on a teacher's shoulder, though only 5 boys are present. Another, from a church picnic in 1893, shows a 4th shadow beneath a trio of women, the shadow seated though no one is. And the third, a hunting portrait from 1879, reveals a pair of boots standing behind a tree, though no one stands behind it. But it was the bench photographs that held her attention. "Limb redundancies," she called them. "Always seated. Always cropped. Always with children." In her view, certain locations or perhaps moments formed folds in time, echoes. She theorized that emotional memory could act as bait for lost fragments of consciousness. "We remember our past," she wrote, "but does it remember us?" Most scholars laughed her off. "Poetry, disguised as science," Whitgrove scoffed when interviewed years later, but those who had seen the plate in person did not laugh. In 1959, Whitgrove returned to the Ruck image one final time. He had been invited to speak at a symposium in Boston and brought the reproduction with him. During his presentation, he paused, adjusted the projector, and froze. The audience waited. He was staring at the slide in silence. Finally, someone called out, "Dr. Whitgrove?" He turned, pale as snow. "There's a hand," he whispered. "It's near the left boot." I never saw it before. The session ended early. In the years that followed, the photograph was re-examined countless times. Some claimed the legs changed positions depending on the viewer. Others said the toes had become more defined, almost curled. One researcher fainted during an infrared scan attempt, claiming he saw movement under the emulsion. None of the three theories, shadow, prank, or spectral intrusion, could fully explain the Ruck Plate. Each explained a fraction of the mystery, and each collapsed under closer scrutiny. But one fact remained. The legs never left the plate, and the plate never stopped warping those who looked too long. On November 4, 1979, the Bellamy Folklore Institute was quiet for a Saturday morning, its east wing still echoing with the residual hum of climate control vents and the soft clicks of curator footsteps. The traveling exhibit titled "Apparitions and Artifacts: Forgotten Faces in American Photography" had drawn modest crowds until that day. Nothing unusual, nothing that hadn't been seen before, but everything changed at precisely 10:41 a.m. Dr. Eugene Mourner, a visiting historical archivist from Providence College, stepped into Exhibit Room 3B holding a notepad and a half-drunk cup of instant coffee. The Ruck Plate sat at the far end, behind a simple glass panel, mounted in a black walnut frame. There were no flickering lights, no sound effects, just the photo. Two boys seated on a bench, their faces solemn, their woolen coats stiff with age. Eugene took 3 steps forward, brow furrowed as he leaned in for a better view. Then he froze. At the boy's ankles, just beneath the hem of Benjamin Ruck's coat, there was something new. A pair of pale, emaciated hands. They hadn't been there before, not in the published studies, not in the Institute's archived photos which Eugene had reviewed the night before. These weren't smudges or damage marks. They were human hands, adult-sized, curled slightly upward as if waiting to grasp something. Or someone. Eugene stepped back abruptly, his coffee sloshing onto the floor. His breath caught in his throat as a strange pressure built in the room, like someone had sealed off the air. He looked around. The room was empty, not a sound. "Hello?" he called out, voice trembling slightly. "Is someone playing a joke?" No answer. The photo remained still, but the hands, God, the hands, looked more defined the longer he stared. He squinted, watching the fingers. Were they shifting? Eugene stumbled out of the room. He didn't stop until he reached the security desk. "Seal off room 3B, he said, his voice clipped and urgent. "Now. No one else goes in there." The guard blinked at him. "Sir, it's just a photo exhibit. Is something wrong?" "There are hands in the Ruck Plate, new ones. I need someone to verify that print hasn't been tampered with." The guard hesitated, then picked up the radio. By noon, 2 curators and a technician had joined Eugene at the sealed room. None of them wanted to be the first to look. "I'll do it," said Miles Decker, the youngest technician. His voice was steady, but his knuckles were white as he pushed open the door. Inside, the air felt different. Thicker. Charged. Miles approached the plate, squinting. His jaw slackened. "Those weren't there yesterday," he whispered. "They're under the boys' legs like someone's crawling out from under them." He backed away fast. Within 2 hours, the exhibit was shut down. A hastily printed sign went up. Room 3B temporarily closed for restoration assessment. But those who'd seen it knew that was a lie. The director of the institute, an aging man named Lawrence Greaves, ordered the photo sealed and locked away. No reproduction, no scans, no prints. By evening, the door bore a handwritten warning in red marker: Ruck Plate, do not reproduce. The image was placed inside a temperature-controlled drawer behind 3 layers of protective glass and radiation film. No one spoke publicly about what had happened. The Institute's press team issued a vague statement about preservation errors. But among staff, the story spread like wildfire. Whispers said that anyone who stayed too long in room 3B complained of cold ankles, of whispers, of a feeling like something unseen had just ducked beneath the bench they stood beside. 17 years passed. In 1996, a new digital archivist named Theo Manning attempted to update the Institute's internal servers. Among the many forgotten files, he found an old scan of the Ruck Plate, labeled simply Bellamy Archive, 3B_Ruck Plate_octscan.img curious. He opened it. The image appeared clear at first. The same boys, the same bench, the same shadows. But this time, the hands were more than visible. They were clutching the boys' ankles. Theo blinked and looked again. The fingers had curled tighter. Were they always clenched like that? Were the boys grimacing now? Were those new lines on their faces? The screen flickered once, then went black. Within 30 seconds, the internal server collapsed. 3 adjacent collections were lost, unrecoverable. Photos, records, and restoration scans dating back decades were corrupted beyond repair. The Ruck Plate scan was never opened again. Theo quit the Institute 2 months later, citing personal health reasons. He would not elaborate. To this day, no verified descendant of the Ruck family has ever agreed to speak publicly about the bench. Several were approached for interviews. All declined. One man, a distant relative traced through marriage records, reportedly slammed the door when the name Dunsmuir was mentioned. The photograph remains locked in its drawer, deep within the sealed east wing. No one has dared remove it. And room 3B remains permanently closed, with the label still taped to the door: Ruck Plate, do not reproduce. Was it a shared hallucination, a photographic fluke, or something older, patient, and waiting to be seen? If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe and turn on notifications for the next file. Disclaimer: this script is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, institutions, and incidents are invented or used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. Created solely for entertainment. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It explores themes of mystery, the supernatural, and the eerie fascination with the unexplained in history. Its purpose is to raise awareness, spark curiosity, and inspire reflection on how perception and imagination shape the stories we tell.